Okay, let's see here. So for those of you who may have just come in, I was just mentioning that if you wanted to get a jump start on downloading the software and any packages you might need for your laptop, you can go to this. You can go to our homepage, or you can go to www.mangoselm.org and download the packages for this afternoon. And you might have to install some related packages like Java or things of that nature. So anyway, to avoid a little troubleshooting, that might be a good idea. So in the morning session, what I've been asked to do is give some background about the computational methods, and then in the afternoon what I plan on doing is going through a tutorial on the codes that we've developed for doing fluctuating hydrodynamic simulations. So a lot of the motivation for this as part of the CM4 group has been to develop new computational capabilities for doing mesoscopic modeling, quite generally. So I'm not necessarily focused on any one particular application, but I will, by way of motivation for this talk, focus on work we've done on soft materials, and also some work we're also doing on modeling fluidics, in particular looking at things like electrokinetics, going beyond the standard sort of theory such as the Poisson-Boltzmann. So taking into account things like sterics, discrete density fluctuations, things of that nature. So in this talk, I'm mainly going to focus on the fluctuating hydrodynamic component, and then I'm going to run through the applications as part of the motivation. So let's see, I notice my laser pointer doesn't work on this very nice and beautiful screen here, so I guess I'm tall, I can kind of point. Do you have a stick or anything like that?
It's too high tech here.
All right, that's fine, no worries. Okay, so as I mentioned a moment ago, oftentimes we're very interested in systems that have mechanics that emerge from interactions that are on the order of kVt, the thermal energy. And what makes this very subtle is that for such materials, you often have this trade-off between the enthalpy, the kind of energy that drives the interactions and the formation, let's say, of something like your gel or your lipid bilayer, in competition with the cost of basically having that ordered structure, namely the entropy. And so there's often a subtle interplay between entropy and enthalpy in the sort of bulk material responses that you would get. And also in these systems, when you subject them to things like shear, the hydrodynamic coupling between the microstructures also plays a really important role. And so you sort of have this problem of trying to resolve a very wide range of temporal and spatial scales, simultaneously taking into account hydrodynamic effects, thermal fluctuations. And in the context of things like fluidic devices, you have in addition the challenge of dealing with potentially complicated geometries. And so oftentimes if you look at something like an analyte particle or even a polymer, like a fragment of DNA, you sending it through one of these devices, you may have to deal with something like an obstacle of Post, which is used to do things like gel-free electrophoresis. Or you may have to deal with confinement effects. Because you're in a slit channel, the hydrodynamics of a very different nature than if you are dealing with, sort of bulk three-dimensional flow. Similarly with the membranes, there it's not so much confinement, but you have a two-dimensional fluid interface, and again the sort of physics changes quite significantly when you go from sort of bulk three-dimensional fluid to basically fluid flow on a manifold, and I'll talk a bit about that. So there are many approaches that are taken, obviously, in practice to these problems, and part of the goal of CM4 is to develop new computational tools for doing simulations and modeling in regimes which aren't necessarily accessible by currently available methods. And so our goal is really to push from the bottom up the length scales and the time scales that we can access. So it's mesoscopic. I would say it's closest in some sense to the existing methods related to coarse grain modeling, where we're looking at trying to get to length scales of hundreds of nanometers, if not up to microns, or you could do larger, of course, and time scales on the order of nanoseconds to milliseconds. Those things would be very expensive to do with fully atomistic molecular dynamics. So it's really in this mesoscopic physical regime, and the approach that we want to do is, I'll say in a moment, kind of a hybrid between continuum mechanics and using coarse grain models in order to get computational efficiencies, as I'll discuss in a moment. The main reason to do this continuum hybrid with a coarse grain model is if you're trying to model something like a lipid bilayer membrane, as I've illustrated here, you can see that if you do a fully atomistic type description, you spend a lot of your computational effort for this two-dimensional interface on the three-dimensional bulk fluid. to get the hydrophobic hydrophilic effect captured, which drives the formation of the bilayer. There are slightly more coarse-grained models, right? There's the Martini model, which is very popular. And then more recently, there's been fully implicit solvent models where you remove the solvent altogether, but that's great for doing equilibrium studies, but if you want to look at any type of kinetics, like I was mentioning with these rheological responses, then you somehow have to still get the contributions of the solvent to momentum transfer in the kinetics right back into the model. So, okay, so there's many different ensembles you might consider. I'm going to, as I said, develop these fluctuating hydrodynamic techniques, which is kind of a hybrid between continuum mechanics and coarse-grained models. And then just to give kind of a context of where our techniques fit in terms of the zoology of ensembles and thermostats, we're mainly going to be an extension of something like Langevin dynamics, but without hydrodynamic modes. And we're able to take into account different ensembles such as constant number, pressure, temperature, or technically not equilibrium ensemble, but one that has interesting steady state behaviors, things like constant shear, volume, and temperature. Okay, so that's a kind of a motivation of why we're interested in this mesoscopic regime, namely to study soft materials and their sort of emergent mechanical properties. I'll motivate a lot of the work on the material side through this kind of problem related to lipid bilayer membranes. And so if you're not familiar, I'll give a very quick background. Obviously, this is very important in biophysics, but there are also a lot of other technological applications as well, using lipid bilayers as anchoring sites, do catalysis, other types of things. Lipid bilayer membrane, in cell biology at least, serves these diverse roles to compartmentalize the cell. It's a very dynamic structure, as you can see from my illustration here, diverse functions. You have different cell organelles, like the Golgi apparatus, where things are constantly budding off, shipping different types of proteins off to different parts of the cell, fusing with, let's say, the outer cell membrane as part of the secretion process here. So there's very dynamic functions and topology changes and things that are going on with these lipid bilayers. So modeling at the level of continuum mechanics is quite difficult, right? So I'm going to show you a coarse-grained model, which in part can be used to do some of those things. It's typically in a fluid phase, so the two-dimensional interface is a fluid with respect to any in-plane shear, and it's elastic with respect to bending modes, deformation. And there's very interesting molecular mechanisms that you can use to explain that behavior. So it's a fluid elastic sheet, and I'll just say a few words. So these are formed of these little amphiphilic molecules, and the interesting property of the chemistry is that the head groups like to interact with the water and be solvated, whereas the tails do not. And so what happens is that if you put enough of these in a fluid, they tend to either collect at the interface, or they'll form micelle, putting all their tails together to exclude the water and leave the heads in contact with the solvent, or they'll form a bilayer structure if you have sufficiently large concentrations. Okay, and there's all kinds of interesting ways that you can look at these from the point of view of pre-established mathematical theories and physical theories. Like, you could consider these lyotropic liquid crystals and think of them either in the smectic A or smectic C phase, depending on the situation. I'm not going to focus so much on that continuum mechanics modeling. I'm mainly, for the purpose of this talk, going to focus on our coarse-grained descriptions. The other sort of motivating area was fluidics, microfluidics, or even down to smaller scales. And again, there we'd like to study transport phenomena, things like capillary electrophoresis of, let's say, oligonucleotides, or in this case I'm showing a picture of a colloid. And the challenge there is to capture not only the hydrodynamics in the channel, but also the electrokinetics, since that often plays a really important role in driving the flow through electric osmotic flow. You turn on an electric field, and if the walls are charged, there's slightly higher concentration of one of the ionic species near the walls that kind of drags the fluid along. And what you'd like to know is, if I have a certain colloid that has a certain charge and a certain size, what's the rate of transport down this channel? And that's often very useful in practice, because you can use capillary electrophoresis to basically separate different types of analyte particles, which then have downstream utility in diagnostics or in purifying samples. So I won't say too much about the details there, but some of the key features, again, that we have to grapple with is you have large surface area to volume ratio. These ionic double layers can be comparable to channel width, so that makes it difficult to use things like traditional Poisson-Boltzmann. The Brownian motion, both of the ions and the analytes, obviously play an important role in that sort of subtle structure you have there, an interplay between the colloid and its double layer and the wall and its corresponding double layer, which would affect, obviously, its transport rate. So you have hydrodynamic flow and proximity to walls and other geometric features to grapple with, and I'm going to mainly in this talk focus on the solver aspects of this problem. Okay, and then there's often, if you look at a system in practice, even as you can see in my illustration there, it's not really a continuum distribution of ions to a good approximation. There's really quite a bit of density fluctuations locally that this colloid is going to experience in its environment. And there's often, as well, if you have a multivalent system, you also often get correlations between the individual ions. And so that's not necessarily captured in something like a Poisson-Boltzmann theory. Okay, so there's need for developing more theory and methods that kind of access this mesoscopic regime between doing something like a fully atomistic simulation, which would be very difficult for these length and time scales, versus going all the way to continuum mechanics and doing something like the Poisson-Boltzmann theory, which misses a lot of the important effects. Okay, and so I'm going to introduce methods that are capable of handling the hydrodynamics, the fluctuations, as well as the geometric aspects of the problem and capture things like the confinement effects or mobility dependence based on your proximity to things like walls or structures. Okay, so I think I've done enough on the motivational side. I mentioned already a fair amount about atomistic molecular dynamics being a widely used tool to study these types of mesoscale problems and these emergent coarse grain models. This is just mainly to give some context to where our methods kind of fit into what currently exists, and as I mentioned, part of the goal of CM4 is to develop new tools and computational capabilities to access regimes which weren't necessarily easily done with other types of existing tools. So we're really interested in this case of these implicit solvent coarse grain models because this allows you to go to very large length and time scales because you've removed the solvent degrees of freedom. So for something like a two-dimensional interface like this lipid bilayer, but you could study other things, of course, you've removed the solvent degrees of freedom, and that hydrophobic hydrophilic effect that I showed you in the previous slides, which were driven by the surrounding solvent lipid interactions, is now folded into an effective free energy of interaction. And here I'm just showing this very beautiful model by Marcus DeSerno's group, which was introduced in 2007, where he studied things like virus capsids, coming down and interacting with the bilayer. And so that's a really wonderful problem, and you can study the equilibrium configurations that you get. But if you wanted to study anything related to the kinetics, right, that's missing in these models because you've removed the solvent degrees of freedom. So we're going to use fluctuating hydrodynamics to develop dynamic implicit coarse grain models, which we think would have quite a few interesting applications. And it doesn't have to be, again, to just lipid bilayer membranes and using that as way of motivation. You could do it for colloidal systems. You could do this for interesting types of polymeric fluids, star-shaped polymers or even polymers that have interesting kinetics and crosslinks. So basically what we need is a thermostat which is going to reintroduce those lateral correlations that was missing because of removed solvent degrees of freedom. And we've done a fair amount of work on this, both at continuum mechanics level and at this sort of coarse grain level. Okay, so I think I said enough about sort of the modeling resolution. So we're not aiming to get, all the way down to the quantum chemistry or the detailed chemistry that would depend on the particular molecular architecture. We're really, trying to capture those larger length scales, as I mentioned, hundreds of nanometers, on the order of tens of nanoseconds to milliseconds or more. So we're really relying upon, coarse graining and looking at things at that scale. And I think I've motivated enough interesting phenomena for where that regime does become very important and useful. Okay, so we're somewhere between the continuum mechanics and sort of the molecular descriptions. So just to give you a sense of some of the history or the background in fluid structure interactions, obviously this is a well-appreciated problem in many areas, arising in continuum mechanics. So there's been very beautiful work that I'll talk about on immersed boundary methods, originally initiated by Charles Peskin and his collaborators, motivated by heart physiology. And so that's a very difficult fluid structure interaction problem because you have the heart, which deforms the walls of the heart. That's a muscle. The muscle contracts, right? And all of that coordination with the fluid mechanics, right, is what leads to a healthy heartbeat and an efficient pumping of blood and so on. And so he developed very detailed models of things like heart valves and the muscle mechanics and their kinetics of the heart, taking into account the heart physiology. He had the benefit of being an MD PhD, so he was not only trained as a mathematician as part of his PhD work, but also as a basically a medical doctor with expert in physiology. More recently, there's been work done at other scales to look at things like hummingbird flight, and there you have very turbulent flows. That's a very challenging problem. And so there's a lot of history in developing good computational methods for doing fluid structure interactions. And so being a student of Charlie, in part, what I wanted to do is adapt these techniques now to that mesoscopic regime that I mentioned before. So our goal would be to leverage a lot of that machinery that's been developed for doing computational fluid mechanics of fluid structure interaction efficiently. But there are additional challenges, and I showed you in the previous slide, thermal fluctuations start to play an important role. So we'd like to take these approximate CFD descriptions for fluid structure interaction and figure out smart ways to thermostat them so we get results consistent with statistical mechanics. And so just to give you a sense of why thermal fluctuations are important, this is just an example of a little vesicle that's coated with a, well, there's a chemistry design, so it's got a coating that when you expose it to light, it changes the local spontaneous curvature. So you get a switching between kind of a spherical shape to then one that has a little bud because of that change in curvature. And so if you look at that movie, you'll see that thermal fluctuations play an important role in that shape transition. It basically bumps you over a little energy barrier. And the budding itself would probably also involve thermal fluctuations to ultimately snap off because there's an energy barrier for that to occur. So thermal fluctuations play a really important role in the kinetics, not to mention what's driving that ultimate formation of the bilayer in the first place and allowing it to maintain that fluid phase. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's many approaches you might take to doing fluid structure interactions in practice. So one approach that might come to mind is to look at, two models. You have your elastic structure, you have your fluid, have two different constitutive equations, and then you couple them through a traction stress and a kinetic condition like, no slip at the boundary. But as you can see from this little illustration, this is very nice work, by the way, but it just illustrates that if you really do this traction stress approach, and there are good reasons to do that for many applications. You might be interested in vortex shedding or other important things that happen right at the interface. You have to do quite a bit of computational work to resolve that accurately, right? So that you get good traction stresses to drive your elastic deformations. The other extreme that you might go to, again, there's good reasons to do this in practice, is you might say, okay, well, let's just look at the quasi-steady state balance between the elastic forces in the system and the shear stresses in the fluid. And if you do that, you can often write down analytically a coupling tensor. So if you have two spheres, you can write down analytically what the hydrodynamic coupling tensor is, so that if I apply a torque or a force to one sphere, how the other sphere is going to respond, in its translational or rotational motions. But that becomes problematic, of course, if you have a system which has any kind of polydispersity, or the structures themselves have the capability to deform and so on. So we're going to take an approach that's kind of in between these two extremes. And in some sense, in various limits, you could realize either one of these. But the approach that I'm going to take is going to be closely related to the immersed boundary method. And so what we do mathematically is we're going to solve the fluid, but we're not going to require solving all those detailed interactions right at the interface. We're going to coarse grain that out. And so if you do that, the approach that we're going to take is the immersed boundary method. And the simplest formulation would be to use a kernel function so that the particles basically move at the local fluid velocity. And then any forces that act on a particle are going to be imposed in the fluid equations. They'll enter as force density source terms through that same kernel function. And so Charles Peskin, for the heart physiology model I mentioned before, worked out a lot of the important theory for how to do this in a numerically robust way, so that, for example, you don't get excessive losses through this interconversion between the Eulerian and Lagrangian frames, which is namely an adjoint condition. And then he developed a kernel which has nice numerical properties, and for that I call this the Peskin delta function. And I'll mention that in my model, I never want to take this to be a true Dirac delta function. There's always going to be some finite length scale that will play an important role if I want to represent particles using these point Peskin delta functions to get finite diffusivities and mobilities and things of that nature. Okay, so that's the basic idea, and that saves you a tremendous amount of computational effort because you can use traditional Eulerian solvers, things like FFTs if you're on a periodic domain, and this microstructure does not disrupt that symmetry. It's done as a separate equation that follows the local fluid velocity or enters as a source term. All right, I'll give more mathematical details in a moment. And we've sort of generalized that to say you don't necessarily have to do the Peskin delta function. You could just have these general operators, lambda and gamma, that basically tell you how the microstructure and the fluid talk to each other. So lambda being the force spreading operator and gamma being the velocity averaging operator that gives you a reference velocity for the body. All right, so the challenge for me is to figure out how to thermostat such an approximate formulation of the mechanics in a manner so that I'm consistent with statistical mechanics. Okay, and as I mentioned, there are many thermostats you might use in molecular simulations, things like Berenson-Hoover, Berenson, which uses momentum redistribution among the molecular degrees of freedom, or things like Noisy-Hoover, where you have these sort of artificial degrees of freedom that act like a heat bath. That's really great for equilibrating your system rapidly and for sampling configurations, but it doesn't really capture kinetics properly, right? So it's a good technique for that purposes. You could use something like Langevin, but what I want to point out, the problem with Langevin is it lacks a Galilean invariance. You're always referencing your interaction with the solvent with this sort of ambient frame, this lab frame, 0. So this would come from, right, the detailed interactions ultimately of your microstructure with the solvent. You're replacing that by this linearized, drag law, right, negative gamma V. But notice it's not Galilean invariant because V is always referenced relative to 0, right? So if you use the moving frame, that would change quite fundamentally the drag law. Now, the other thing I'll mention is this is not momentum conserving, right? You lose momentum here, but you balance it by the stochastic term. And so if you do something like a traditional Langevin, you basically have this momentum sink, this stochastic source term, and that really destroys a lot of the lateral correlations. And then something I didn't mention about the lipid bilayer case is that if you treated it as a two-dimensional fluid, that would be problematic because of Stokes' paradox in 2 dimensions. So there's a well-known result that goes back to Southman-Delbruck in the 1970s, a very nice PNS paper that they published showing that you can compute the diffusivity of something like a protein idealized as a cylinder in a 2D fluid by doing some very careful asymptotics given the thickness of the membrane. And what they noticed is that you have to take into account the traction stress with the surrounding bulk solvent, even though the membrane is probably hundreds of times more viscous than the surrounding solvent fluid. And that's what gets you around the Stokes paradox for things like lipid bilayer membranes, is that there is a 3-dimensional fluid which regularizes that logarithmic singularity you would otherwise have. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that if you try to model a system like a lipid bilayer membrane using something like Langevin dynamics, you've destroyed a lot of those important lateral correlations. You won't get Stokes paradox, but you will have destroyed those long-range correlations that you would expect to have in such a system. So the idea of the fluctuating hydrodynamics approach, just to give some context, is that instead of having just a momentum sink, we now have explicit hydrodynamic modes for the solvent, and we use these velocity averaging operators to give you now a reference. And then, interestingly enough, the fluctuations can also enter back through that effective drag term because these modes will be fluctuating. So that becomes the source of the thermostating. And I'll mention, because this is dissipative by fluctuation and spatial consideration, there's also a thermal force which enters into the momentum equations for the microstructure. And we'll come back and talk about that in some more detail. Okay, so this is a new thermostat in some sense that generalizes what you would do in a Langevin type simulation. And now you'll have, I'll show in, later, the momentum transfer through those lateral effects because of the hydrodynamic flow and the traction stress. Okay, so if you're not familiar with where Brownian motion comes from, I put together this illustration here. So if you put a particle in a fluid, obviously in macroscopic systems, it won't really do anything interesting. But if you get down to small scales, where the size of the particle becomes comparable to the size of the solvent, every now and then you'll notice there's more collisions of the solvent molecules with this colloid on one side than another. And so that leads to a little jump, right? And then that process repeats over and over again. And that's ultimately the origins of Brownian motion. And so what we'd like to do with the fluctuating hydrodynamic formulation is replace that detailed solvent kinetics and all those degrees of freedom with an effective continuum field that has the same spatial temporal correlations. And so I'm showing you here, I'll give you more detail in just a moment. But that's sort of the idea. And then if you have now a continuum description for the solvent, I don't need to have necessarily as many degrees of freedom. I can do things like filter so that I'm only resolving fluctuations down to the relevant length scales. I can also do other tricks to take larger time steps because I have a very clear handle on the random field. I can represent it in things like a Fourier space and do exponential time stepping, which again allows some computational advantages as opposed to doing the fully atomistic or molecular level simulation. Okay, so Landau and Lifshitz initially extended the hydrodynamic equations to include fluctuations through a random stress, which is shown here. And by using fluctuation dissipation considerations, you can work out under a few assumptions, like that it's a Gaussian random field, delta correlated in time. You can work out what the spatial correlations are, and that's given here, and it's proportional to the viscosity of the fluid and the thermal energy. And the other structure that you see here comes from the fact that the dissipative operator in the fluid equations are the Newtonian stresses. So if you work that out carefully through fluctuation dissipation, namely the Nyquist relations, you'll end up with this correlation structure for the random stress. Okay, so that's nice. So that'll basically allow me to replace this molecular solvent model, at least to some approximation, with this continuum Gaussian random field. But there are a number of issues that arise here, right? One is that this physically can be written down, and it's pretty clear what our intention is, but it's mathematically actually quite difficult to put this on a rigorous footing. One challenge that arises is, you notice this is delta correlated in space, and now you're taking a divergence. So this will actually be noise, which is worse than white, right? It'll actually have a divergent Fourier series, which means these fields U are not really defined pointwise. So the fluctuations are very erratic, and so things like this convective derivative term really doesn't make sense. You would have to think about U in the sense of a distribution, right? A generalized function. And taking products of distributions is not well defined. Now there are ways maybe around that if you revisit some of the continuum mechanics and regularize things like that U, but it's very difficult to grapple with this issue in a completely satisfactory manner. And then there's also other issues that arise because of this delta correlation again. You end up exciting all the different Fourier modes of the fluid. So it means you have very rapid dynamics as you go up in wave vector. And so we've dealt with that by developing some time step integrators, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. Now the thing that I want to emphasize is what we've done is started by looking at what Landau and Lifshitz done, but extended to include fluid structure interactions so that we have a viable thermostat for something like the immersed boundary method. So this is the key part that we've added to this story, and I'm going to show you in a minute that that significantly changes the way in which you ultimately drive stochastically the system, given that fluid structure interaction component. Okay, so here's the formulation of the stochastic immersed boundary method. So we have the fluid equations, as I've written up at the top here, subject to the incompressibility condition. We have the structure equations, as I mentioned, and the way that the immersed boundary method works is the structures move according to a local velocity averaging. So you basically take your kernel, center it at the current location of your particle, average the velocity field, and that's the kinetics for how the microstructure updates. And then any forces that act on the microstructure, those are imparted to the surrounding fluid environment through the same kernel, which I call delta A here. Keep in mind the Peskin delta function. And in that manner, we account for the momentum change of the microstructure. So we're really using the fluid equations to do double duty here, right? There are going to be momentum conservation equations, both for the fluid mechanics and for the microstructure. We're just assuming in some sense that there's a tight coupling between the microstructure with its local fluid environment. So, for things like no slip, it moves basically at the local fluid velocity. So this provides a nice coarse grain model. Okay, and I already mentioned that this can be leveraged to do very efficient fluid solves, doing things like finite volume discretizations and fast Fourier transforms. Okay, so the part I'm going to talk about is the thermal fluctuations. And so the way that you thermostat the system is you can go back to look at fluctuation dissipation. In particular, in stochastic analysis, there's a lemma which basically says that if I know what the equilibrium fluctuations of the system are, and I know what my dissipative operator is, there's only one way to stochastically force such a system to achieve that equilibrium. And so here, we know what the equilibrium fluctuation should be because we have in hand, the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution, and the kinetic energy is the governing energy. And by backing out using that theorem, we end up with what are called the Nyquist relations. And so we know the stochastic force should be given by this 2 kBt mu, Laplacian of a Dirac delta function. And that's the thermal force term that I put into the fluid equations. Now, what that Nyquist relation does not get you is this drift term. And we've derived that in a number of different ways. One way we've done this is through a stochastic reduction procedure, which if there's time, I'll tell you a little bit about. So there's a thermal drift term that comes about, and that's really important, and because this, if you did not have it, would lead to spontaneous drifts in the dynamics of the microstructures. So this comes from the fact that if you look at the formulation, the configurational degrees of freedom and the momentum degrees of freedom are not Hamiltonian conjugates, and so you don't have the usual Liouville theorem on the phase space. You have a generalized Liouville theorem that has a metric factor, and if you work that out carefully, you end up with this thermal drift term. Okay, so there's a number of issues that come up in numerically approximating these equations. As I mentioned, they're stochastically forced using a very irregular thermal field, namely something which has this Laplacian of a delta function space. So if you look at in Fourier space, it's actually diverging. So you have to be very careful when you discretize the equations. So if I use something like a central difference operator, thinking about finite volumes as my motivation, and you look at the spectrum of the dissipative operator of the continuum mechanics that's shown in red here, the Laplacian, goes like the square, right, of the wave vector. And you look at something like the discretized Laplacian, you have the well-known aliasing effects that lead to a quite different dissipative behavior, especially as you get to the large wave numbers. And so one of the things that we do in order to discretize these stochastic equations in a consistent manner is we pay attention to these dissipative rates, because ultimately we have to have fluctuation dissipation balance to get the right equilibrium fluctuations. So we have to approximate basically the thermal term not by just doing some naive averaging of the continuum mechanics, but by essentially creating a mimetic dynamical system, a discrete dynamical system that mimics the statistical mechanics you have for the proper full formulation. And so if you do this, you can deal with quite a bit of interesting and complicated computational situations that arise in practice. This is just showing a coarse refined interface. And so if you did something like a naive averaging of the random fluxes at the interface, you get these kind of long-range correlations that come from some of the issues I just alluded to. If you use this discrete Nyquist relation, you can control the thermal fluctuations so that you get your target covariant structure, namely you'll get Dirac correlations in space. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting things I could say here about how you actually develop particular schemes for different types of discretizations, namely finite volumes versus things like finite elements, which we've now done at this stage. But the key relation to use is this fluctuation dissipation balance, along with those other reduction considerations I mentioned, so that you get the right thermal drifts. Okay, so this is what we do. So the particular thermal forcing you introduce is very closely constructed to balance the nature of the discretization error that you're making for the dissipative operator. Now there's a separate issue, which is now we have a way of spatially discretizing the system. We still have to deal with the temporal dynamics. And so this is just a back of the envelope calculation showing you the different timescales involved in the problem. So if I look at the fluid modes by their wavelength, like 10 nanometers, 1,000 nanometers, versus the timescales involved with interesting kinetics that you might want to resolve, like the diffusion of a colloidal particle or the undulation of a membrane or polymer, you get these time scales out. So for a particle to diffuse its own length scale, if it's a nanometer, is on the order of a nanosecond. About 10 nanometer particles would take 10 to the 3 nanoseconds. I'll mention that this is basically water, right, at physiological temperature. So I didn't want to write down too many parameters on one slide, but the key point I want to make is that you have a difference of about 1 million between resolving things on the length scale of your particle and the time scale in which diffusivity happens for that particular particle. So that's very problematic for practical simulations. So that's a manifestation of this stiffness I mentioned because of the thermal noise exciting all the different Fourier modes of the fluid. So one of the things we want to do essentially is filter out those fluctuations which we don't think are that interesting in the kinetics, but somehow account for their contributions to the overall fluctuations that occurred over that window in time. So there's really two ways you could go about this. One way is you could try to basically develop an integrator along the spirit of what I just mentioned. You could also do perturbation analysis on the SPDs to reduce the description. Maybe remove the fluid relaxation modes, right, or filter them out above some particular length scale, or below some length scale, I guess in this case. And I'll come back to this. So I'm going to show you how you can develop a stiff solver for doing the stochastic integration. So if you look at the fluid equations, you notice that in fact they're actually linear equations, and when you've discretized them, now you just have a large dimensional linear stochastic differential equation. And so what we can do is we can write this in a somewhat abstract way, but you'll see in a moment that that is useful to kind of hide the gory details so that we can deal with each piece in turn. So the Newtonian stresses give you the viscous damping, you have a particle contribution coming from the force spreading, and then you have the thermal fluctuations, which I can write in the convenient form of Q, an increment of Brownian motion. And then we have the incompressibility constraint, which I won't say much about. And then we have the microstructure equations, the effective kinetics of the microstructure, and then the force spreading for any forces that act on the particle. And again, what we'd like to do ultimately in our calculations is resolve the temporal dynamics over that red window to get from the beginning to the end of that red window, but taking into account these under-resolved fluctuations over that time scale. And so I'll first deal with the fluid equations. And so you notice that they're linear, so we can do this trick of basically an exponential integrating factor. And if we do that, we can write the state of the fluid at time t in terms of this exponential damping term, state of the fluid at time 0, this time integration of the particle forces over that time scale, and then a contribution that comes from the integrated fluctuations that we had over that time scale 0 to t. And now, provided t is not too large relative to the microstructure dynamical time scale, then we should have a chance at resolving the appropriate kinetics of the microstructure and filtering out the fluid, kind of exploiting that separation in time scales without losing much accuracy. We've done careful error analysis that shows the precise conditions that you can have. So this would require us basically to generate the following terms, this exponential of whatever our dissipative operator is. In the case of the Laplacian, luckily in Fourier space you can diagonalize this, so that's quite readily computable. You have to compute the particle contributions, which I'll discuss in a moment, and then you have to compute this last random variable, which is the time integral of those thermal fluctuations which you've under-resolved.
Hold on.
Yeah, sure.
So you say it's a calculus, but it's a linear equation. So I can use Stochastic. Why do you say you would? I mean, why do you need to use?
Oh, you mean, yeah, there's no distinction between Ito and Stratonovich in this particular case. Because the noise term, I agree with you, it's not a multiplicative noise, right? It's just a constant noise. Yeah. I'm just saying Ito calculus, meaning that I'm going to use things like the Ito isometry. I'm going to handle the stochastic aspects of the problem carefully, right?
Nothing special about Ito.
Yeah, sure. I could say I'm going to do it with Stratonovich calculus, no problem. But you'll see later when I start talking about the overdamped case, regime 4 we call it, then you do have a multiplicative noise. Then you do have to make a distinction between whether you're taking a Stratonovich or Ito interpretation. And that has important implications for this drift term. Okay, so if you look at the particle contribution over that time scale 0t, what I can do is I can make the approximation based on this t, again, not being so large that I'm under-resolving the particle motion, because remember, the whole point of this is to get those contributions of the rapidly excited, relaxing fluid mechanics taken into account. We do want to resolve, right, the diffusive motion of our microstructure. So we can make the approximation that the particle forces, right, which depend on the microstructure configuration, if we make the approximation they're effectively constant, then we can replace this integral with this particular form involving an exponential of our damping factor. So that gives us the time integrated contribution with the damping taken into account over the window 0t of the particle forces in the momentum change of the fluid. The thermal fluctuations is a more interesting case. In the thermal fluctuation, we have to take into account this integral. This has a deterministic integrand, and so we know from the Ito calculus that this is a Gaussian random variable, and from the Ito isometry, this has mean 0, and it has covariance structure given basically by square of the integrand. In this case, you take the outer product. And so that's given here, and with a little work, something like using Fourier methods to diagonalize your Laplacian, based on the Fourier symbol of the Laplacian, you can write down explicitly what this covariance structure is, and it decouples mode by mode, and you can generate that. So that gives us a procedure now to generate the state of the fluid at time t, given this damping of the state of the fluid at time 0, the particle contributions over that window of time, and now those fluctuations which we've under-resolved over that time. So the second part now of the problem is to deal with the this is just the details of what I just said a moment ago. And I don't want to say too much about this in the interest of time here. You can go and look at the paper for that. What I want to do is talk about the microstructure and how we update that part of the problem. And so to integrate the microstructure degrees of freedom, we again make this approximation that this timescale t is small relative to the dynamic timescale of the microstructure. And if you do that, you can approximate then this moving average here by the stationary average at the initial state of the microstructure. And so that reduces the problem for updating the particle degrees of freedom in terms of getting statistics on this time-integrated velocity field. And so what we can do is work out what I call I-vel up here, which is just the velocity contributions from 0 to t of u of SDS. We can now work out its covariance structure, again resorting to results from the Ito calculus, namely the Ito isometry. And so you can work out what the mean of I-vel is. It's given by this expression. It's a little bit messy, so you don't have to absorb it now. I just want to kind of give it in sketch. You can look in our paper for the details. And then the covariance structure is, again, using that Ito isometry, which is given by these two terms, which can be worked out in detail, and I haven't written out what the final integrals are in the interest of not filling up the slide with too much notation. And now one of the important things to remember is that this I-vel, this time-integrated velocity, is correlated with the time-integrated fluctuations that we've incorporated already in the fluid equation. So to get that to be consistent, there's a cross-correlation between I-vel and I-therm. Again, that's worked out by the Ito isometry, and that's given here. So you can work out what all these terms are, provided that you can exponentiate the dissipative operator. And so for things like uniform meshes, that can be done quite readily, right, using FFTs, because the Newtonian stress tensor yields Laplacian. Okay, now there are ways to generalize getting all of this for finite elements, and I can discuss that offline if you're interested. There we resort to things like multigrid to do our sampling instead of FFTs, and there are some ways to approximate the exponential operator as well. Okay. So that's basically a summary of the stiff integrator. You do this top line here, which involves exponentiating the operator given to account for the dissipation from the previous state, the memory, if you like, of the previous state over the time window, particle contribution, thermal fluctuations, and then the structure equation is just updated by averaging this now time-integrated velocity statistic, which we've computed all these correlations for. Okay, so a lot of random variables that you have to generate, and to get this covariance structure to work in practice requires efficient methods to generate Gaussian random fields with this prescribed covariance structure. But luckily, things diagonalize for FFT, so that can be done very efficiently. You'd be in trouble for a fluid mechanics problem if you had to do things like Cholesky factorization. Okay, so we've done a lot of work validating this approach, and if you resolve the inertial relaxation of the fluid mechanics, you can show agreement with these classical molecular dynamic results for Brownian motion, where initially people thought, well, I should get an exponential autocorrelation function, but because of hydrodynamic memory effects, you actually get this power law tail, which comes from the fact that if you have a fluctuation of the particle, it drags fluid along with it. There's a finite time scale for each of those fluid modes to relax, and if you work out that full spectrum, you get this power law. We've also shown that if you under-resolve the fluid mechanics using our stiff integrator, you still get the right diffusivities. There's some theory we've developed for diffusivities of reverse boundary style particles, just showing you get the right Gibbs-Boltzmann equilibrium distribution. So, okay. Now, can these ideas be extended to other coupling regimes and coupling types? We could talk a bit about that offline, and there's some work we're doing on that. So a slight generalization related to that question we found very useful is to look at the inertial regime and to perform reductions in order to get equations on which to then do our numerics. And so here I'm writing down the momentum equations of the fluid and the microstructure separately, and now I'm using a drag law in my microstructure equation and a corresponding source term, which is the complement to that drag law. And we've worked on now thermostating this inertial formulation, which we refer to as stochastic Eulerian and Lagrangian methods, because you can put a very large number of these different continuum mechanics descriptions in this kind of common framework. And so the thermal fluctuations then in this case take on this form. I think in the interest of time I won't go through all the details, but just mention that there's interesting components that arise from the approximate fluid structure interaction, or the coupling operators if you like, and they appear in this interesting form in the off-diagonal cross correlations between the thermal field and the microstructure thermal fluctuations. Okay, so there's many different ways that you could do coupling. One of the key ingredients, if you want to develop your own coupling operator, Obviously, you wanted to conserve momentum so that the force spreading operator is not lossy. One of the interesting things that was noticed, this goes back to work by Charles Peskin in his original formulation of the immersed boundary method, is that if you look at the energy of the system, namely the kinetic energy plus the potential energy, you can look at what the time rate of change of energy is in the absence of dissipation in the system, so ignoring the Newtonian stress term. And what you find is that if you do not want your fluid structure, microstructure interactions to be lossy, there's an adjoint condition that must be satisfied. Basically, this term arises and this term arises with the opposite sign when taking the time derivative of this energy with this approximate immersed boundary style fluid structure coupling. So we've just generalized that for general operators gamma and lambda, as I've shown here. So a key ingredient when you formulate these approximate fluid structure interactions is that you satisfy this adjoint condition, or else you'll end up with a lossy fluid structure interaction simply from changing from the Eulerian reference frame to Lagrangian or vice versa. And if you did that, you would have to then deal with additional challenges in the thermostatic. Okay, but this turns out to be a very useful property when you're deriving coupling operators, because it means that if I know the kinetic response of my microstructure, I can use the adjoint condition to get the flip side, which is what the force spreading operator should be, so that now if I have an active model where I apply a force or a torque, I'm self-consistent with respect to this mechanics principle. So this is just showing the immersed boundary technique, and you can easily verify that that is got the adjoint property. The type of hydrodynamic coupling it gives you is very closely related to the Rodney-Proudner-Yamakawa tensor. We discovered this when we were going through and validating some of the early methods. And so it gives you a regularization in the near field that you can pretty much quantitatively match to Rodney-Proudner-Yamakawa, which is maybe not so surprising because Rodney-Proudner-Yamakawa uses a similar kind of kernel spreading idea in their formulation mechanics. You can do more sophisticated types of coupling. You could have particles or microstructures that have structure where you haven't built in explicit force interactions. I mean, obviously you can build anything you like with the immersed boundary method out of your beads with an appropriate force law, but that can get quite expensive, even introduce other timescales resulting in stiffness. This is just showing that I can create a little colloidal particle that has both translational and rotational degrees of freedom. There's no bead-bead interactions here. This is purely done through the coupling operators. And so I can, motivated by the Faxon relations, I can come up with what the translational and rotational motion would be of such a colloidal particle given, let's say, an imposed surrounding flow. And that's what's done here. Integrating over the surface, I use Lebedev quadrature to do that. And that's just showing the discretized version of taking the surface integral to get the translational velocity and the surface integral to get the angular velocity of the particle. Now, the adjoint conditions can be used to get me a corresponding collection of force spreading operators. And that's what's done here with lambda 0 and lambda 1. And so now I have a model that I can look at two particles, let's say, where I apply a force or a torque, and I can look at their hydrodynamic interactions. And you can validate that with respect to the well-known multipole expansions, namely the Rodney-Proudner tensors. And you can show very good agreement provided your sort of structures are not too close together. So there's no free lunch here. If you don't resolve the details of the particles, you don't get things like hydrodynamic lubrication effects. And then now you can do things like stochastically diffusing colloids that have translational diffusion as well as rotational diffusion with the appropriate hydrodynamic cross correlations. Okay, so I think I'm supposed to go until 10:30, is that right?
Right, 15 more minutes.
Okay, all right, so, yeah. So I think, okay, good, yeah. Yeah, I just don't want to go over. It's like once you get started, you know, it's... Also, I could use a coffee break as well. Okay, so I already mentioned quite a bit about the numerical stiffness aspects of the problem. I think in the interest of time, I won't go through this in too much detail. I just want to show you that there's a second approach that you could take, starting with this stochastic Eulerian Lagrangian set of SPDs to try to develop viable computational methods. That is to do a perturbation analysis on the SPDs by identifying certain parameters, namely separations of different timescales. So that could be your small parameter, the ratio of, let's say, the microstructure timescale relative to the fluid mechanics relaxation timescale. Okay, so this is just giving a quick sketch of how you do these asymptotic analyses for stochastic differential equations. So if I start off with my stochastic differential equation dZt, you have a drift term A, and you have now a potentially multiplicative noise. Make George happy. you can deal with this as well through the following. This stochastic differential equation corresponds to the following infinitesimal generator. So basically, there's a direct correspondence between your stochastic process and a corresponding PD, which describes the statistics of that stochastic process. And mathematically, it becomes much nicer to do asymptotic analysis in the language of PDs than to try to do asymptotic analysis in the context of measure theory, right? So you have this infinitesimal generator given the drifts and the multiplicative noise in the system. And the statistics that you can describe using the PD are basically the expectation of the process starting in state x at time 0, evolving up to some time t, taking f of the state of the process at that time. That expectation we could write as u of xt, and then it becomes convenient to describe the statistics in terms of the evolution of this, right? Now, you can see here, because this is valid for pretty arbitrary choice of f, namely a compactly supported, twice continuously differentiable function. If you know the infinitesimal generator, you can recover the statistics of the stochastic process, right? You basically make f an approximation to the Dirac delta. And vice versa, if you know the stochastic process, then obviously this would give you those coefficients a and b in the infinitesimal generator through, again, appropriate use of that test function. Okay, so now what you can do is you can do your asymptotic analysis on the backward Kolmogorov equation, derive a new infinitesimal generator, convert it back, and now you have a new stochastic description, which is reduced, right? The overall degrees of freedom that you're dealing with. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to do our perturbation analysis in terms of the variable u, expanded in this form, and then we're going to split the degrees of freedom z into slow and fast degrees of freedom. And that's actually an important part of this decomposition. That may be hard in practice, right? Because you have to identify what's your slow manifold, what's the parameterization of that, what's the fast manifold. But assuming you can do all that, then we can collect the terms in the operator a epsilon. And when I talk about slow and fast, what I really care about is those derivative terms. It's okay if a or b depend on slow and fast both. It's really that derivative term, right, which is generating the dynamics that we want to decompose. So everything that involves derivatives in z involving the slow degrees of freedom I'll throw here. Everything involving the fast degrees of freedom I'll throw there. And then I'm going to split this a little bit further into this form 1 over epsilon L2 plus epsilon bar L. This is basically the fast degrees of freedom, and this L2 is going to determine for me what the stationary distribution is, essentially, that's used to average the contributions of the fast degrees of freedom given the slow degrees of freedom. Okay, so you can think of that as, I have this kind of slow manifold and things are fluctuating around that slow manifold, and this L2 operator is telling me basically the generator for that type of dynamics. Okay, then we have the slow part of the dynamics. I'm going to split that into two operators, which I'll call bar L1 and L1. The bar L1 will basically be whatever you told me was slow, averaging out the mean with respect to the stationary distribution I got from the fast dynamics that I've identified. And then I'll just call L1 just whatever's left over, like the relative to the mean. Okay, so putting that all together, I can write this operator A epsilon in terms of bar L1 plus epsilon L epsilon. This is basically the leading order contribution. If you have bar L1, that kind of determines the dynamics to leading order, and this one then is the high order stuff. So the most interesting case is often when that's 0, but I put it here so that you can do the leading order plus the next order up. Okay, so L epsilon then is just collecting all the stuff that comes in at the next order, and it's given by this, after you do the asymptotics, of course. Okay, so then as you take epsilon going to 0, you can resort to solvability conditions, basically the Fredholm alternative, in order to derive conditions then for each of these different orders, U0 and U1. And what comes out of that when you collect your terms together, a lot of sort of math that I'm obviously skipping here, you get this infinitesimal generator that has dependence on these original operators you've identified. Bar L1, as I mentioned already, comes in at leading order. The next order is bar L0, where bar L0 has the following relation to the operators that you told me about when you were doing your slow-fast decomposition. Namely, this is L1 plus tilde L2, which is sitting right here. You average that with respect to this stationary distribution that came from the fast dynamics, and then you have L2 inverse L1. So provided you can compute this last averaging procedure, usually inverting L2 is the challenging part there, I can get an effective infinitesimal generator then for the contributions of those fast degrees of freedom that I've eliminated. Okay, so it's a little bit involved, but the point is you can now identify the drift and the noise components from the form of this infinitesimal generator, and out comes your stochastic process, which is now a reduction of what we started with. Okay, so that's the overall perturbation analysis that we've used on the Selm formulation in order to do reductions in different regimes for the purposes of developing different computational methods. So I'll just skip this slide. This is just showing what happens with zero drift, which simplifies a little bit. So you have different regimes. You start off with the inertial formulation here. You can look at a regime. We've done all the non-dimensional analysis, but I'm just showing it here in physical terms to make it intuitive. You can imagine a case where the mass of the, let's say, particle or the microstructure locally is smaller than the displaced fluid mass. And if that's the case, then you're going to end up with a regime where the momentum of the microstructure relaxes very rapidly, right, relative to the dynamics of the fluid and the configuration of each fluid. And if you do that, you get this reduction going through that procedure I just explained, and then these thermal fluctuations. An important term that pops up from the reduction analysis done using that fairly rigorous approach based on the perturbation theory is this this drift term, right? So if you only resorted to things like the Nyquist relations, fluctuation, dissipation, balance, you might have missed that important drift term. There are other considerations by looking at invariant distributions that could also be used to motivate where that comes from. Going back to the generalized Louisville theorem, there's a metric factor on the phase space, and that's ultimately the origins of that. You haven't used conjugate variables for the configuration and the momentum degrees of freedom. So there's compressibility in the phase space, if you like, as the system gets pushed around. You can also look now at a regime where we take the coupling between the microstructure and the fluid very, very strong. And in that case, now we've eliminated a lot of terms that you see here from the finite slip that we had. Right? You could use that to model a diffusing particle that has finite slip. This would be now the case where you take epsilon going to infinity, so that slip goes away, and now you have the momentum equation for the fluid. The structure equations just follow the local fluid velocity, and this is actually nothing more than the stochastic immersed boundary method, and that's how you thermostat. Then you can go one step further, and you could take the sort of relaxation time scale to the fluid to be very rapid relative to the microstructure. And if you do that, then this can all be reduced to just the microstructure equation in terms of now this effective hydrodynamic coupling operator that tells you how the microstructures interact. And that's obtained in our description through basically a quasi-steady state of the fluid equation. So this provides you a computational approach to solve, for example, in confined domains or with complicated geometry, where now you don't need to know the Green's function analytically, right? You can get it from doing numerical solves. And so this shows you how to thermostat that. And again, this important drift term, again, rises. Right. And that's really important to get the right, in this case, Gibbs-Boltzmann with detail balance, which you'd expect for such an equilibrium system. All right, so this has been written up in a paper that you can look at if you'd like more details. So this provides a really nice collection of stochastic equations now that you can use as a starting point for doing your fluctuating hydrodynamic solvers, removing timescales which maybe are not of interest in the particular physical problem that you're considering. Okay, so we've also done a lot of work developing adaptive meshes for these fluctuating hydrodynamics techniques. So I'll say a few words about that. And again, that's been motivated in part by these problems in fluidics where you might have something like a set of posts that you run a polymer through to do things like gel-free capillary electrophoresis, or you may just have interesting geometries that arise naturally in your problem. Maybe you're confined within a vesicle, or you have some other interesting constraint where you want to resolve at higher resolution in one part of your domain versus other locations. So we've developed, I guess I don't have slides for the full finite element formulation, but anyway, we've developed discretizations of those fluid equations that I've shown you in the previous slides with thermal fluctuations incorporated, using not finite volumes, but rather finite element discretizations. And that poses a number of challenges because now the discretizations are no longer non-uniform and therefore require us to generate stochastic random fields resorting to methods other than Fourier transforms, right? That's what allowed our methods to be very efficient. We could generate the required thermal fields with a specified covariance structure pretty much directly by diagonalizing everything in Fourier space. Alternative methods such as Cholesky would be very expensive to get your factors, and you'd cost in the order of the number of degrees of freedom squared in order to generate factors. So what we've done is we've developed stochastic iterative methods for this purposes of sampling the thermal fluctuations. And so we've done it, initially we introduced this method for finite element methods. You could also do it for finite volume methods with adaptive meshes, as I mentioned. That gives you a certain prescribed covariance structure, which is difficult in general to factor in order to get your thermal fields. Okay, so I guess in the interest of time, I won't say too much. I've mentioned a lot about these fluidic devices. One of the things that we're looking at are these discrete ion models for electrokinetics using these fluctuating hydrodynamic approaches, and looking at things like diffusion within confined geometries and interesting structures. Now, the key challenge is, in order to capture the physics in these regimes, you can see from what I said, we'd like to go beyond Poisson-Boltzmann theory. Okay, so I'll come back to that at the end. The stochastic iterator methods, I think I want to focus more on the computational stuff. The basic idea is that you can use, if you were to solve the fluid equations, the elliptic PDEs, one natural way to do that would be to use something like an iterative method with some type of preconditioning, like multigrid, right? What we're doing here is we want to exploit those iterative methods not only to solve for the deterministic fluid mechanics, but also as a way of generating Gaussian random fields. And this could be applicable quite widely, not only to these stochastic PDEs, but whenever you need a covariant structure which has a sparse structure to it, or its inverse happens to be sparse. Okay, so the idea is we take the usual linear iterative method and we add a stochastic forcing term to it. And then you are ultimately trying to realize fluctuations of this field which have some target covariant structure, which I'll call C. Right? And so you can go through basically a statistical mechanics analysis of the stochastic iterative method, and you can figure out what the covariant structure would need to be for your driving field in order to realize fluctuations on the lattice or in your finite element degrees of freedom which have covariance C. So it turns out, which is really useful, is that if I look at the autocorrelation, you can think of this as a Gibbs sampler. So at every time step, I have if I started with the initial state in the given target probability distribution, at every time step I will have, again, the random variable in that target distribution, but it'll be correlated, right? And so an interesting question is how many times do I need to iterate before I get a variate which is decorrelated, right, from what I started with. And so you can do analysis of the autocorrelation of these samples, like xn plus m, and what you find is that the autocorrelation satisfies n phi m, which is great news because it means that the autocorrelation of these samples follows exactly the same error analysis as you would have for the deterministic solver. So doing things like preconditioning will greatly speed up the process of decorrelating in your iterative method. So we can exploit things like multigrid, as I'll show you in a little bit, to get a Gibbs sampler which is decorrelating basically in a constant number of iterations. So it becomes a very efficient way to sample. So this idea traces back to some work that was done on lattice models by Goodman and Sokol. So they had introduced stochastic Gauss-Seidel iterations and worked out what the form was for the covariance structure of the driving field to realize a given C. So it's given here by looking at the Gauss-Seidel diagonal lower and upper decompositions. And anyway, you can work out what the G is in terms of your target C. And it takes on this form that I mentioned here. And there's some ways to simplify that further. So, okay, so if we couple that with doing multigrid iterations, we're doing a variational form of the multigrid method, so geometric multigrid. This is just showing how you can speed up the decorrelation. So in red here, I'm showing the Gauss-Seidel sampler. And I guess in this case, it was actually done using algebraic multigrid. That's what the AMG stands for. The important property, though, is to have the variational structure when you use your prolongation and restriction operators. This was work done with Chris Seifert and Jonathan Hu and Pat Plunkett. And so this is just showing that if I do preconditioning on this particular lattice here with the target covariance structure given by my fluctuation dissipation analysis on the stochastic Morse boundary method, then you end up with a rather long tail for doing simply Gauss-Seidel. If you precondition with AMG, you get a much more rapid convergence. And you can see here that the rate of convergence speeds up basically by a factor of a few hundred. So you have to do basically 100 times less iterations in order to achieve the same degree correlation as if you had done just the Gauss-Seidel.
So just a question,
yeah.
So what the matrices are sparse, or what's it?
Well, okay, so you have the Laplacian that comes from the stiffness matrix on whatever your finite element discretization was. So yeah, that's sparse. And what you're trying to do is then sample something which is effectively negative the Laplacian. That's the correlation structure that you need.
So you get an elliptic PD and so on for your matrix.
You get an elliptic PD for the fluids problem, and then you have to sample something like either L or L inverse. So if you're doing the Stokes case, you would have that H-Selm operator that I showed in the reduction slide. Now I have to get covariance structure which goes like negative L inverses effectively. I mean, there's other subtleties in there with force spreading and averaging and projection for the incompressibility, but in spirit it's just like sampling a Gaussian random variable that has covariance L inverse, negative L inverse. Yeah. So it's long range. But L itself is sparse. So you're iterating L.
The preconditioning is on L.
So you do all the preconditioning on L, and the iterator, the stochastic iterator you can show gives you the covariance structure L inverse out.
But for example, if you use these hierarchical matrix methods, you could compute the square root of L inverse.
Okay.
That would work.
Yeah, we could talk about it. I'd be very interested if there's a more direct way to do it.
Yeah.
That might be more computationally efficient. That'd be great. But this is what came to mind as a workaround once we started dealing with finite element discretizations. So this is just showing you get a very nice speed up, and I guess he did slightly different measures of the speed up in terms of looking at overall iterations versus sweeps visiting each individual site. Okay. So this is where the speed up factors were listed. Okay, so basically you get a factor of, in this case, 10. I mean, this isn't a very large mess. But anyway, you can obviously optimize this quite a bit. This is just our initial stab at the problem. So we have solvers for doing now fluctuating hydrodynamics using finite volume, spectral, finite element type discretizations. We've overcome those key challenges of generating the stochastic driving fields in a computationally efficient manner. Some of it involves factorization, as I mentioned. When you have fast Fourier transforms, we have now these stochastic iterative methods to deal with the challenge as well. We can now deal with these complicated geometries, spatial additivity, and so on. So we think we have a nice tool set here for solving quite a wide range of interesting problems in that mesoscopic regime that I mentioned, kind of sitting in between the kinds of problems that you might solve with continuum mechanics and the kinds of things that you might consider trying to reach for with atomistic or coarse grain type models, but maybe too large a scale given the challenges with the solvent. So we've been applying this to a number of different applications, as I showed in the beginning. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to wrap up on this slide. We've looked at material properties, basically the emergent mechanics in lipid bilayer membranes. We're now characterizing things like the effective shear viscosity and intermonolayer slip in the Dicerno coarse grain model, which is obviously an important first step to using that for kinetic studies. And as I showed you in a couple of the slides, we're also working on coarse grain models of electrokinetics, which would be relevant to transport in different types of fluidic devices. So I think I'll end there, and I'll take any questions just to keep the schedule on time. And in the afternoon, what I plan on doing is going through the software. There's a lot of coding and hard work and sweat that goes into making all of these things work in practice. And so I'll talk a bit about an entry point into using some of these techniques yourself, using our software. And really the best way is to contact me if you're interested in using these things. And some of the stuff has been really cleaned up and released, and some of it we sort of have in a more academic working mode, but we'd be happy to extend or to talk further with you about interesting directions. So anyway, thank you all for your attention.
Any questions before we take a break?
Sure.
Or maybe for the interest of everybody here.
Yeah.
So most of the people are math here. So you're solving stochastic PD. So
yes.
Taking like stochastic 101, I would say, well, you are trying to do white noise, stochastic PDs, and what I learned is that you cannot really get errors better than h to the 1/2 strong sense convergence. And now on top of that, you actually take a Laplacian. You're very bold. Take a Laplacian of a white noise. How do all this work? In other words, is there a theoretical analysis that shows that these methods converge? Is there error estimate? Is there? I kind of know the answer, but maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. Yeah.
And also on top of that, we do it, and we all do that. Is you have this approximation of the boundaries, right? Immersive methods have these inherent errors. Which
yes. Yeah.
Because it's like the semi-Lagrangian method.
Yeah, and we know those are probably first order accurate if you were to compare to no-slip boundary conditions.
Pockets of error.
Yes,
Even
agreed,
there.
yes, yeah.
And has anybody thought about this?
Well, yeah, okay, so I have multiple answers to the question. Hopefully that, yeah, will address what your concern is. So the first one is, I think, you're right, you have these very irregular fields. Even the Landau-Lifshitz fluctuating hydrodynamics is not really clear what the field is, that you're really interested in the point-wise values of the fluid. You're obviously not. What you're interested in is some observables of the system. So I would say the right way to look at convergence is kind of from a weak point of view. So for example, if I were looking at something like a colloidal system, I might look at something like the dynamic structure factor, right? And I'd be happy if I capture the dynamic structure factor above a certain wavelength. Of course, as I get down to, you know, molecular, atomic scales, whatever, we don't expect the continuum mechanics to be an accurate description of the physics anyway there. And that would be similarly true with the numerics. You would be then picking up artifacts of your particular choice of Laplacian discretization, right? Finite volume or what have you. So I think the right way to look at it is to project whatever these, you know, fluctuating fields are that are coming out of the SPDEs, and then look at their convergence at different scales. And the right way, I think, to do that is looking at dynamic structure factors for materials of interest. The other thing is we have done careful analysis, error analysis, and it's quite difficult. I mean, we went through and we looked at, for this exponential time stepper, if you make different choices of parameters, you know, how separated the microstructure dynamics are relative to the fluid mechanics, what the particular errors scale like. So you're right, if you do something like Euler-Maruyama, you will only get like an h to the 1/2. But there are other higher order stochastic integrators that you can use. There are, for example, stochastic Runge-Kutta methods that can be also applied. So.
Okay, so I guess let's wrap it up here. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you.